But how do you do this? How do you get started? I didn't know anybody in New York.
That's right.
I joined a telephone answering service, and they gave me a sheet listing the advertising agencies that produced the various dramatic programs. And so you would, from talking to other actors, that you would meet on the third floor of NBC. Incidentally, nothing like that exists anymore. In the old days, the third floor at NBC was where everybody congregated. There were Colbee's, which is non-existent now. Colbee's was the restaurant at CBS, 485 Madison Avenue. So if you wanted to meet any of your friends or just find out what was going on, you just ended up on the third floor of NBC over at Colbee's, and you kind of got the word there. It was all passed on. Everybody congregated there, and it was social. And also, there was a good chance to nab a director as he walked through from one studio to another, because the third floor was where a great many of the dramatic shows came from the studios on the third floor. But radio was really my first love, The great camaraderie that existed in radio in the early days, before your time, Dick, when there was a relatively small number of us, I don't know how many exactly, but a fairly small group of actors who were fortunate enough to be in demand most of the time. You could work, and did work, 7 days a week.
It's 6 p.m. on Wednesday, January 11th, 1956. I'm at Colbee's restaurant on the ground floor of the CBS headquarters at 485 Madison Avenue. I'm about to have a bite to eat with the man you just heard, Mandel Kramer. Yesterday at Edwards Air Force Base in California, U.S. Air Force First Lieutenant Barty R. Brooks died in the crash of an F-100 Super Sabre. The accident was caught on film. Word from Memphis is that a young singer named Elvis Presley recorded a new song called Heartbreak Hotel. Today's cover of the New York Daily News shows Grace Kelly in Monaco, but the interior pages talk about the rising problems in Vietnam. South Vietnam President Ngo Dinh Diem issued an ordinance giving his government almost unchecked power to deal with any opposition. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union has approved technical specifications for an R-13 submarine-launched missile. And earlier today, the 1956 Chevrolet Corvette was announced. It will cost $3,120. It features a new body, convertible top, optional power steering, optional hardtop, and roll-up glass windows. The V6 option has been dropped in favor of either a 210 or 220 horsepower V8 engine, and a 3-speed manual transmission is now standard. So what's the main national news up for debate? It's whether or not President Dwight D. Eisenhower will seek a second term. After suffering a heart attack in September of 1955, Ike is still undeclared, meeting with an array of doctors to gauge whether the rigors of running for re-election will cause undue health issues. The United Press reported on Tuesday the 10th that 60% of the more than 400 doctors polled felt that Dwight would be able to serve. Perhaps some insight into Ike's psyche was gleaned when on Monday, January 9th, he once again took over full White House duties, including naming Bernard M. Shanley appointments secretary. Meanwhile, on NBC Radio, Keys to the Capitol is airing.
What's going on in Washington?
Ike in the second term, will he or won't he?
Don't worry about Ike. He'll do all right.
Super bomb test, destroyer or savior?
Is everything peaceful in Korea?
That's how we're going to...
From Washington, NBC News brings you transcribed Keys to the Capitol, a weekly news program in which the National Broadcasting Company's top Washington reporters and commentators discuss with you the news of the week and what's behind it. Tonight you will hear Herb Kaplow, Esther Van Wagner Tufte, Ray Scher, and Richard Harkness. NBC News has given these people the weekly assignment of going through Washington's official doors to learn the background of our national policies. We bring you now Keys to the Capitol. And first, here's NBC White House correspondent Ray Scher.
Well, the easiest way I know to start an argument in this town these days is to start talking about the second term. Will President Eisenhower or won't he? This morning, the president's 3 top physicians, including a heart specialist from Fitzsimmons Hospital in Denver, examined the president, electrocardiograms, blood tests, and all that, and pronounced him in excellent physical condition. The first time I can remember they've used that word, excellent. Now, this is the sort of information the president will use in making up his mind about the second term and announcing his decision by the middle of February or whenever it is. On the basis of what the president indicated Sunday at the news conference in Key West, I think most of you would agree that he's at least tentatively made up his mind but that he's going to marshal all the factors in his mind between now and, say, the middle of February, talk to his advisor, and perhaps change it by the time for the decision. I happen to think he leans toward not running. Other people are playing their hunch the other way. Sunday, we took a little poll of White House correspondents in the Key West press room, and it came out 11 thought he would not run. 3 of the newspaper men thought that he would. Suppose we take a little poll right here now. Esther Tufte, what do you think?
Well, I
First
don't...
we take the poll, then I'll come back to you. Yes or no? That's what I want to know.
I think no.
No. All right, Herb?
No, Ray.
Dick Harkness?
Oh, yes.
Well, we've got 3 no's and and 1 yes here. Because you're the only yes...
Which means I'm right, because usually about 3 out of 4 people are wrong in this town. Go ahead, Rick.
All right, Dick, let me ask you, why do you think he is going to run? What's your basis?
Well, I think 2 things, largely. I believe, first, it's this man's physical recovery. As you say, excellent today. I think living properly, that he may look forward to 4 years more of White House and certainly 4 years more of life. Second, there's this man's sense of humor. I think that helps him through. Then there's and most important of all, this sense of duty. Ray, this goes back, right after World War II, when Mr. Eisenhower, then General Eisenhower, flew home. I remember being at the airport here in Washington. Group of correspondents had an interview. Somebody said, "General, do you think that there'll be World War III?" I've never seen a more sincere look on the man's face, a more dedicated look. He said this. He said, "If I thought that there was going to be World War III, I would have jumped out of that plane in mid-Atlantic." He was dedicated to peace then. He's in a position now to do more about cementing the peace. Regardless of what happens to him personally, I think that if he believes in the next 4 years he can contribute to world peace, that he will make himself available again for a second term.
Very well said. Esther, you said no. What's your basis?
Well, I can use the same argument that Dick did, only turn it around. I think his sense of duty is the very thing that'll make him not run. Because I think he'll feel that there's always a big question mark, not only in his own mind, but in the people's mind, that here is a man who must always qualify everything he does by the condition of his health. And I think the only thing maybe that might make him change his mind, as some Republican said at Nixon's party the other night, is if the communists and Democrats make him mad enough, he might still run. But I have a feeling that it's no. I agree with you, Ray.
Herb Kaplow?
Along with the points that Esther just made, Ray, I remember, I think it was 2 weeks before the president took sick out in Denver, there was that breakfast meeting with the Republican National Committeemen from all over the country. At that time, the president made 2 points which I think are particularly appropriate to remember. One is that the Republican Party could not let itself become dependent on one man. And the second point was, the president reminded these people that there is still his health to be considered, the health of any possible candidate, which might become a factor. Now, this was mentioned 2 or 3 weeks before the president had his heart attack. So he was thinking along the lines of health that time and along the lines of the indispensable man.
I happen to have here the notes of the press conference we had down in Key West on Sunday, and for what it's worth, of course, you can read this thing both ways. There's some indication in this thing that he's thinking about running again, but it seems to me that there are more indications that he's thinking the other way, and that's why I sort of suspect that he's tentatively, at least, made up his mind not to run. I'd just like to read you a few things that we find as we go through here. For one thing, he said, "I think I am as ready to go to work as a person could be after the physical experience I have been through." Well, he uses that phrase, "as a person could be." Later on, they asked him about this sense of duty, Bennett. Did he feel a sense of duty? And he said, "But where does the sense of duty point, and who determines what the duty is?" He said, "That's a very tricky question when you go into this problem," as if to say, well, there's no one that can say one must feel a sense of duty toward being a second-term president when you've had this warning, this heart attack. And later on, the point that one of you had mentioned a moment ago, he said that it's a very critical thing to change governments in this country at a time that is unexpected. He seemed to be saying here that if he should not finish out the second term, why, it might bring a lot of turmoil, which sounds like the kind of a thing a man might be thinking about who was thinking maybe of not running again. And there's one other quote that I want to bring in here. He said, "There are also things that happen to the human body that, after all, maybe a man isn't described fully as healthy." aside from all that, watching the man around the White House, he certainly isn't acting like a man who's not going to run. He's carrying on full steam. He's having a lot of meetings. He's meeting a lot of people, and it's awful hard to make up your mind from just watching him.
I wonder if all of us can agree on this point. I think agreement on this program would be novel and refreshing, maybe. That while he talks about his trusted advisors with whom he will consult on this question, the bulk of those trusted advisors, of course, I think will recommend that he run. However, knowing the president, that this is a decision which he will make finally and make personally in his own intellect and in his own good conscience, that nobody else can make it for him, that he must make it, Dwight D. Eisenhower alone.
That's the point that Dr. Paul White keeps hammering on, Dick. Every time we see the doctor, every month or so, he's always asked, well, do you think the president should run again? And he said, well, he's going to make his medical report. He's going to make his medical evaluation in February, but the president himself must make up his mind. He can't tell him what to do.
I think there's one other consideration. I don't think there's much doubt that if the president runs, he will win. I think it's probably pretty generally considered. Except I wonder how you people feel. What will be the extent of the feeling among voters that they should not take a chance on a man who has had one attack?
Well, I think you bring up a good point, Herb. I think that they'll be voting for the vice president, not the president. So it becomes increasingly important that the man who has a second place on the ticket be actually of presidential timber when he's selected.
Are you saying that it should be someone else than Mr. Nixon?
I think Mr. Nixon has the advantage of being the forerunner at the moment, but I heard the other day that Mr. Nixon might even bow out if he felt his unpopularity with the independent voter and the dissident Democrats was so large that it would imperil the party winning. It seems pretty magnanimous for any politician to do such a thing.
Amazingly so.
But that's what I was told.
Well, you were discussing Mr. Nixon running as vice president if Mr. Eisenhower ran again as president.
Yes.
Doesn't it seem as though they could hardly withdraw Mr. Nixon's name under those conditions?
It would be difficult to do. On the other hand, he could withdraw himself. And you hear all kinds of talk about all possible combinations of tickets. Eisenhower and Dewey is being talked about. Last night at Senator Margaret Chase Smith's dinner for Congresswoman Bolton, somebody came up with the Eisenhower and Humphrey ticket. So I think that, and these are Republicans, that they are casting about in their mind for another combination. They sort of run, I think, in effect, and maybe even go to the people with this psychology. We are giving you a two-president ticket.
That seems to me, though, it would not be a very good campaign plank to take before the people. Here we're giving you two men. It's almost an admittance that the first man isn't strong enough. So it might be a detraction rather than...
Well, obviously, the country's aware that Mr. Eisenhower's had a heart attack, I think, and as we've agreed here, would look at the other man on the ticket much more closely than you would normally.
To carry this thing one step further, suppose we just assume for a moment that the president isn't going to run just for the sake of argument. Then what does he do? Does he indicate a favorite? Does he handpick somebody? How does the party carry on? It seems to me that is a very, very tricky problem for the Republicans.
Well, go ahead.
Don't you think, Ray, that he would be out of character to tap somebody on the shoulder?
Very much so.
And therefore, don't you have the feeling that it might be a list? In other words, he would have a veto power. I don't think anyone would be picked that he wouldn't approve of or like or follow on the Eisenhower program and philosophy. But I can't hardly see Mr. Eisenhower using the pressure on someone else that he resented so much when it was used on him.
Well, but obviously they're setting up to run in an Eisenhower man. Who he might be, I would not hazard a guess at this stage. Because through the favorite sons in New Hampshire, there'll be a pro-Eisenhower slate. John Bricker is going to be a favorite son of Ohio, but the delegates are going to be pro-Eisenhower delegates. And so the Republican committee, so to speak, is gathering into itself these delegates, who will, of course, be for Mr. Eisenhower if he runs. They're basically for the president. But if he doesn't, who will go to an Eisenhower man, whom the president in some way or another will make his preference known. It may be a list, as you say, Esther. But certainly, because this man, if he wins, if he has a chance of winning, has got to be in the Eisenhower image, certainly as far as his political philosophy goes.
Doesn't that sort of set up quite an awful battle at the convention with the other forces, say the Nolan forces?
Oh, let's put it the other way. You don't hear the Nolan, the right-wingers, talking with any hope of putting forward a candidate with any chance of winning at all.
Well, isn't what you were saying, Dick, simply that the people in the party who are largely concerned about party unity and about carrying on the president's program are now making sure that there will be no disunity resulting from his decision not to run and are carefully laying the groundwork for an acceptable candidate, or certainly somebody who cannot be vetoed by any right-wing element.
I think Senator Nolan is going to give a trial run in these primaries if the president says he will not run or if he remains silent. However, I think the strategy of that, well, let me call it a right-wing group, conservative, whatever you wish, that the so-called Nolan group hopes to go to San Francisco with maybe 250 votes, there's sort of a veto power. If they might try to use it against Dewey, for example, somebody they dislike. But I don't think they'll be difficult in reaching a fair compromise on a man who is very plainly an Eisenhower Republican.
After all, they're looking for a winner, aren't they, Dick?
Of course.
And
of course they are.
They've got to find a winner within that branch of the Republican Party.
Talking about a winner, Esther, I think we might look at President Eisenhower's legislative program and its chance of winning passage on Capitol Hill. I think that for so early in the session of Congress, before it's really gelled, that the chief executive seems to have Congress pretty well in hand. Of course, his 1956 legislative program is political. This is a political year, and the president or someone in his image, as we were talking just a moment ago, will be running this fall on this program that he outlined. So while the Democrats may chafe and rail, and they are, of course, the president, I believe, has an excellent chance of seeing most of his recommendations go through this year. For instance, on his so-called social program, the extension of Social Security, the outlook for that is excellent because there are votes in them there are bills. On health, more money for medical research, I think he'll get that. And the same goes for liberalizing our home improvement laws and even perhaps an extension of public housing. We can say ditto, I believe, to farm legislation. Now, no one has come out against so far the president's soil bank conservation idea. The president's difficulty here may be not only the Democrats, but fellow Republicans who want to shovel out even more money to farmers, so there will be a farm program. On national defense, Mr. Eisenhower will undoubtedly get extension of the present defense production law, and it's likely that that pet of his, a vessel powered by atomic energy to show around the world, will pass as well. Now, the chances of his so-called foreign relations program, strangely, I'd put down as not quite so good. The $5 billion bite for foreign aid finds very few cheers in Congress, and one cannot be at all sure that Congress will go ahead now and grant tax benefits for private overseas investments as sort of a private capital point four. Finally, there's what we might call the president's business slate. He'll get extension, no doubt, of our present sales and corporation income taxes, whether he can hold the line on our personal income taxes until we see whether there's going to be a balanced budget, and apparently there will. Well, that's something else again. But all in all, I'd say that the president will fare well on Capitol Hill this year, and why not? Because his program is about as fair dealish as it is Republican.
Dick, you didn't mention the highway bill. Do you think there's going to be a highway bill?
I think the president's highway bill is in quite a little difficulty, Esther, for a very basic political reason. That is, if that bill passes, there'll be a lot of money shoveled out from Washington. If it passes this year, it'll be the Republicans who are shoveling it out before the election. So I think we may find our Democratic friends dragging their heels on that measure.
It just happens at lunch that I talked to George Dondero, who's the Republican ranking member on the Public Works Committee that, of course, as you know, is handling that bill. And he says some way or other we're going to get a highway bill. So that's one man's opinion, but he's close to it.
There's the immigration bill. Attorney General Brownell was at the White House this morning, spent 45 minutes with the president, and said that he talked about the immigration special message, which is going to be out in about 10 days. What they want to do, as you all know, is change the quota system, base it on the last census rather than the 1920 census. And they made a sort of half-hearted effort at that in the last Congress. This time they're starting a little earlier. My own hunch is that that'll have pretty rough going.
Gee, I wouldn't hazard a guess on that. I'm completely uninformed on the subject. If they try to go into the McCarran-Walter Act, the basic act there, I'm sure that Congress will not modify that at this session. although certainly it's the Democratic position through Mr. Stevenson that it should be. But, Ray, I was struck with one thing. This is off the subject. You stated that Attorney General Brownell called the White House and said that he discussed immigration with President Eisenhower. You don't think there's a little politics involved there, do you?
Well, we caught him at the door as he went out. You know, there was this story out earlier in the week, Ray Henley's story, that the Attorney General had called this meeting of the President's advisors yesterday noon to talk about the second term. The story was sort of kicked around, and today Mr. Brownell did admit that he did call a meeting, and we asked him what we were going to discuss. He said, well, it is not in the public interest. And we said, why, Mr. Attorney General, everything you do is in the public interest. And he looked shocked at that. And we said, why did you call off the meeting? He said, oh, it's not, it's just a personal matter. So I would guess that there's an awful lot of politicking going on these days. There certainly should be.
They say there's an awful good cook up at the Justice Department. Those lunches.
No, I think George Humphrey has the best cooking. Say, I started to talk about Congress. Now, let's get back to Congress. But I threw it back.
I had my reaction to your thesis here, Dick, is you make it sound awfully rosy and awfully chummy for an election year with an election coming on and the Democrats battling to make a program of their own. I couldn't be quite as bullish as you are about all of these Eisenhower things going through.
Well, I just don't see on Social Security, some of the health recommendations. Those are the things which the Democrats really originated years ago during the New Deal and Fair Deal. How can they come up all of a sudden now and say we're against it? It seems to me that the most the Democrats can do is say yes, but, and maybe want to do a little bit more than the president wants to do. The Democrats, too, don't forget, have a very rough fight between themselves.
On natural gas.
Natural gas control price bill comes up. You're going to have a real battle. Civil rights comes up. You're going to... Strom Thurmond has already served notice that he's ready to filibuster. And the Democrats may have their hands full thinking about their own party unity, fighting each other rather than fighting the president. Esther, what do you think of that?
Well, I was more interested in your prediction that perhaps most of the fireworks would come on foreign aid and what's happened to bipartisanship. We're not going to change anything basic about it. Do you think that this disturbance, Dick, is going to be mostly on the terms of how much money we spent?
Well, I think it may come to a head over that figure. It seems to me that the Democrats have started out early, and I'm not one who believes that foreign policy should be kept out of the political arena. I think it should be discussed in a political year, Esther.
In a certain concept.
Yes. Well, but just let me finish answering that question. This $5 billion program... I think is too large for Congress to... Senator Walter George, who certainly has been bipartisan on his foreign policy, has come out against it. The size of it. Senator Dick Russell, who's been bipartisan in his approach to foreign policy, has come out against the size of this program. And the French election the other day didn't do it any good either.
Well, since we're on this question of foreign policy, it seems to be a particularly good time to get into a subject which made news today at Secretary Dulles' news conference. His statement today that the United States was not considering giving up their testing of nuclear weapons, despite suggestions that that be done by such people yesterday as Krishna Menon and, I believe, in the Christmas Day message of the Pope, and there were other comments to that nature in the past year. Our people, Secretary Dulles indicated that until there is an effective inspection and disarmament plan, the United States cannot afford to give up testing of the nuclear weapons. In the statement of the Pope, he made the point that there may be certain dangers resulting from the radioactivity which falls after an atomic test. Now, the position of our atomic officials has been that under a controlled test, there is no such danger. The amount of radiation in the air is not harmful, is very slight. There are other points to be made about this whole subject of testing as divorced from the complementary subject of the inspection and disarmament and so on. One is that there are, of course, reputable scientists who claim, along the lines of the statements made by the Pope, that the radiation can cause harmful genetic effects. But on the other side of the ledger, looking at the merits and demerits of testing, there are those people who say that the explosion of such awesome devices as an atomic or nuclear bomb or weapon or device or whatever you call it may be a deterrent to the use of these weapons. Now, I was in Las Vegas last spring for the atomic test then. I believe that the device exploded then, as if I remember correctly, ranged from 35 to 50,000 tons of TNT That is, it was equal to that amount in power. Well, the one which is being discussed now is 50 megatons, which would be 50 million tons of TNT in its power, which would be about 100 times of the small bomb, I guess you could call it small bomb relatively, that I saw out in Las Vegas. Well, just to cap it off, that was some small bomb I saw out there, and it impressed me as being quite destructive in its power. What do you people think about this subject?
Herb, what do they gain by these continued tests? Do they, just because a bomb is bigger, isn't it going to make a bigger explosion? What else do you learn? Why do we have to have so many tests?
Well, I think that there are tactical bombs. There are small bombs. I guess you could call them economy-sized bombs, which would be used if they ever have to be used for certain given situations. And then the large bombs, now whether they're being developed largely to impress people that they shouldn't try to strike us, or whether they actually would be used under a certain situation, I don't know. I think there probably is a double purpose in that.
Well, it seems to me if they were going to set off these tests for their deterrent effect, they would take up the proposal of one of the commissioners, the Democratic commissioner, Murray, who wanted to transport everybody out in the middle of the Pacific and let them have a front seat and watch this thing. But we conduct them in the utmost secrecy.
Well, that's certainly one of the purposes of the last spring's small bomb explosion in Las Vegas.
The one you went to, yeah. This I take to be something else. This I take to be a new type of weapon that must be tested to learn.
Well, I don't know what the size of this weapon will be that they're going to test out in the Pacific later this year. They don't test the small ones out there generally.
Oh, no, that's going to be one of the new
big baby.
Super duper.
Now, whether it's the 50 megaton or not, I don't know.
There have been hints that it will be. And certainly we have it, or expect to have it, as per the Wilson report the other day on civil defense. I, with all due respects to the Pope, and certainly I'm not impressed by Krishna Menon. I wouldn't touch that fellow with a 10-foot pole. But it seems to me that John Foster Dulles is eminently correct in his position. The Pope, of course, is a great spiritual leader. The hymns in my church, onward Christian soldiers, the Son of God goes forth to war. There's nothing pacifist in religion at all. And if this bomb is a deterrent, as Mr. Churchill said so well several years ago, well, of course we've got to test it. How else can we defend ourselves?
I was just wondering how the whole world would feel if we stopped testing bombs and stopped developing scientifically. Certainly people would begin to worry about the survival of the free world, wouldn't they?
Well, that's of course, the other side of the story. Esther, you've just come back from a trip around the world. Is there quite a bit of sympathy with this position that we've made too many tests and we're...
I didn't hear so much about that, but I certainly heard a lot of, call it war talk. You know, Ray, the guns are silent in Korea, but nothing else seems to be. There's fight talk heard on both sides of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which separates, as you know, Korea into two parts, the communist to the north and the non-communist to the south. Well, the reports are alarmingly numerous about the increase of military strength being amassed in North Korea. And the temper of the communists, it seemed to me, was very quarrelsome. For example, they've made 521 complaints of violations of our United Nations troops as compared to only 73 made by our side. Well, these concern, such things as flying over the dividing line, and the American flyers told me that was a pretty easy thing to do. Well, every time this happens, of course, their complaints happen. Then there's a meeting called at the new Panmunjom, and I watched the communists march in to a recent session. Well, they didn't have any Geneva smiles on their faces. Our head negotiator, a certain Navy Captain David Roscoe, said when he came out that the complaint was typical, meaning that there was nothing worth complaining about. It was just routine and very irritating. Well, when things get irritating, you have to have guns firing off. Well, I talked also with the commanding officer of the 24th American Division, and that's the division which is guarding that part of the DMZ where the push southward is most likely to come if any march were made to capture Seoul. Well, Major General S.B. Mason is keeping his troops combat alert. I had a feeling that no one would be surprised if something happened. And those boys out there are getting mighty realistic, tough training on that rough Korean terrain, which Well, it's mighty muddy and the weather is mighty cold. In fact, except that more soldiers seem to be living in Quonset huts than tents, I could believe that the Korean fighting that began in 1950 was still going on. It looked just the same to me as when I was there then. Well, now, on our side, on the United Nations side in Korea, there's always that question of President Rhee's impatience to unite Korea in his lifetime, and let's not forget he's 83 years old. He's the commander-in-chief of the fourth largest army in the world today and the largest in free Asia. You know, more than 20 divisions are in that ROK Army, and they're mostly American-trained and equipped. But at the head of the Army is General Chung. I interviewed General Chung. He's a very sane, realistic man who made the Army of the Korean Republic one of the most stabilizing factors in that part of the world. General Chung would remind his impatient President Rhee that he would need continuing supplies to march north, and they would have to come from America or some of the United Nations forces. So we control any major attempt to storm the communists moving to the north. I was told the ROK Army never has more than 5 days' supply of gasoline, and an army can't move long without fuel. So all is not peaceful in Korea, even if the guns are silent. Does this scare you, Ray?
Well, Esther, I'm wondering, are we going to have to keep American troops in Korea for the rest of our lives, as far as we can see ahead?
Well, it's going to be some time, I would say, before they were pulled out there. We only have 2 divisions there now, the 24th and the 7th. And, of course, the ROK Army has a lot more. But we've got to be there. We guard the most vital point on that line that goes across Korea, the point where they're most apt to break through if they want to march down to headquarters and so on.
Pardon me. Well, I was just going to ask Esther another question. Have you cleaned that one?
Yeah.
Esther, a little broader. I noticed that over Christmas and New Year's, which is a very strange time for people to be away from home, that we had in the Far East, on an inspection, a visit, Admiral Radford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We had Secretary Quarles of the Air Force, Secretary Brucker of the Army, and I believe Secretary of the Navy Thomas.
Yes, I saw him in Honolulu.
That whole
The
group.
troops.
Now, why would that group of people, so high and important militarily, in the Far East over Christmas and New Year's?
I think they feel some of the things that I was feeling in Japan and in...
You have been listening to Keys to the Capitol, brought to you transcribed by NBC News as a way of taking you behind the doors of official Washington with NBC's top reporters and commentators. Tonight you have heard Herb Kaplow, Esther Van Wagner-Tufte, Ray Scherer, and Richard Harkness. Keys to the Capitol will be brought to you at this same time next week. This is the NBC Radio Network.